For everyone with an interest in MASH, or more broadly, steatotic liver disease, Surf's Up, Season 5, Episode 5 of Surfing the MASH Tsunami. Our look ahead for NITs in 2024 starts now.
Today on Surfing the MASH Tsunami.
It depends what question we're asking and answering. Are we trying to avoid liver transplantation, reduce cancer thresholds in these populations that are at higher risk? And we can therefore be a little bit more lenient on the cut thresholds.
Yeah, a single test alone is not going to take you from what is always going to be a low pretest probability in patients who've got metabolic risk factors and modestly elevated ALT. So it's going to have to be a series of tests.
We see a patient with fatty liver disease and he has ALT, double upper limit of normal, and he has a FibroScan that's abnormal. I'm just going to treat him and see what happens, because if I have a drug that's fairly safe, that's the good part.
Once you leave the U.S., there is a clear direct relationship between the price of the drug and the size of the patient population that's targeted. Mm-hmm. So there is a population for which 39 to 52 will be cost effective. There is a population at which 19 will be cost effective, but the 19 population is going to be a lot larger.
I would like to see democracy when it comes to NITs, where you can actually combine FIT4 with a way to measure liver stiffness. There's so many new developments. Actually, at the Desert Liver Conference, we had 4 companies exhibit their technologies that all of them can give you a CAP score and also liver stiffness.
The other thing is patients are going to be asking us about the drug. They're going to be asking, well, why don't I get the drug?
Every week, a global community of steatotic liver disease stakeholders comes together to explore the most critical challenges in diagnosing, treating, and developing medications for patients with MASLD and MASH. Join hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Jörn Schattenberg, liver health advocate Louise Campbell, pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green, and this week's guests, hepatology researchers, and key opinion leaders Naim Alkhouri and Rowe, as they look forward at what news and advice 2024 might bring for NITs. This week on Surfing the MASH Tsunami.
Remember to stay tuned after this episode for this week's question of the week.
So normally we go around and have all the guests say hi once at a time, but I think we're going to start with a guest in particular, our good friend Naim Alkhouri, who's coming off a extremely successful and exciting Desert Liver Conference. Naim, congratulations. And Jörn started this actually before we got on the thing, so congratulations from all of us.
Thank you so much, my friend. It's always a pleasure to be with you and the rest of the team. We had a great meeting, Desert Liver Conference. This is the 3rd annual Desert Liver Conference. We do it in Phoenix, Arizona. We had about 290 attendees, including 30 virtual attendees. We had 32 sponsors in total, and it was a day and a half. We started with the session on the latest and greatest in NIT testing, and then the second day was a full day CME hepatology conference. So we covered, of course, MASLD and MASH in details with Stephen Harrison, Mina Bansal, and Mazen Noordin, myself. And then we also covered topics like PBC and drug-induced liver injury, cirrhosis, portal hypertension, so everything liver. And, I couldn't be happier with the success of this meeting. And I want to invite all of you guys to DLC 2025. We should have the venue and date finalized soon, and then we'll send the invites.
I expect I'll be traveling again by then, so that'll work out fine. I would love to do that. I'm sad I didn't make it this year. Second year in a row, I'm sad I didn't make it, Naim, but we'll talk about how to make it work better next year.
Next year for sure.
Okay, so with us we have, as I said, Jörn Schattenberg. Good evening, Jörn. How are you tonight?
Hi, Roger. Good to see you. And again, congratulations, Naim. From what I heard, it was a great meeting. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there in person. Anyways, I'm fine. It's evening hours as usual when we're recording, Roger, and I'm just happy to be back surfing with the crew.
And Louise, how are you this evening?
I'm very well, thank you very much. I only got to watch the conference on Twitter and LinkedIn, but I got some good takeaways from it. So congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate you.
You guys have really built a first-rate event in no time at all. What, 2 years?
We started this 2 years ago, and then we joined forces with Stephen Harrison. So he was doing the National Liver Congress for about 17 years before he joined us. And he's been part of the Desert Liver Conference last year and this year, him and Jackie O'Leary. So the course director doctors are myself, Stephen, Jackie, and Anita Kohli, who's an infectious disease doctor with me at Arizona Liver Health.
And then finally, I think we have Ian Rowe. Ian is with us. He's bounced in and out a little bit right now. He's on mute. Let's just do Groundbreakers. One good thing, personal, professional, that happened in the last week. Naim, you can choose to say that the conference was yours.
Absolutely.
Okay, I think that's not a bad place to stop. Okay, Louise, Jörn.
Oh, I'll jump in. I'm skiing this weekend coming in Switzerland, so I was able to do an early Mother's Day with my mum and dad over the weekend. So that was a surprise, given I've only just got back from Australia. But it's Mother's Day in the United Kingdom this weekend, so I'm avoiding it. So it was quite nice to spend some time with them at a very nice restaurant. But that was good.
Okay, and Jörn?
Well, let me think. Many things going on these days. Feel privileged to be working at the place I'm at with a great team that's starting to build and many changes to be implemented. So that's a great professional thing, family-wise, and on the private side. And it's getting warmer, so more activities outside. Coming back to running along, the girls riding their bicycles around town. So really a lot of things going on.
Yeah, that'll last for about 2 years, and then they'll be biking so much faster than you can run that you'll look like Run Forest Run if you try to keep up with them. But that's fantastic. Very, very nice.
It'll keep me in shape, Roger. It'll keep me in shape.
You're in pretty good shape already, dude. I'm not worried about that one. And then we have Ian Rowe with us. He might pulse in and out a little bit because he's having interesting connectivity problems, but he's here now. How are you this evening?
Yeah, I'm very good. I'm pleased to be here. It's the first time I've been on the podcast for a little while, so yeah, really excited to be taking part again.
And delighted to have you with us. And we're on a topic where I think you've got an interesting and unique point of view. So my good news for the week. Heading to Texas for 4 days to visit family from Thursday to Sunday, which will be very, very nice. Great family, easy time. And I think that's probably the biggest one I'll go with right now. There are a couple of others, but that matters most. And that will enable us to dive into our episode. As we've been trying to do in the run-up to the magical PDUFA date on March 14th, we've been taking a look at some of the different issues that are going to shape 2024. And this, I think, is in some ways the most important of the ones we've tackled so far. Because when you ask stakeholders, virtually any category, what are the rate-limiting factors for the acceptance of the need to treat disease, the two practical ones that you wind up on, and they're the two that seem to matter most in most people's minds, are A, we don't have a drug, and B, the testing protocols are challenging and confusing. Well, in theory, we'll know the answer to we don't have a drug on March 14th, and I think we're all pretty optimistic that that'll be a good answer, that won't be an issue anymore. So then we go to the second one, which is going to be devilish for quite a while, I would guess, which is NITs, and how to do a good and efficient job of screening the patients that we've got to get into the process, and what do we have to do to enroll the different stakeholders all on the clinical care pathway in playing their roles. So today I want to break that into two issues. A, what's in front of us today, and B, what might come along later in the year. And by today, I mean literally today. So when we think about the starting point for all the clinical care pathways, we start on FIB4. That's one of the places I just wanted to start. How do we feel about FIB4 right now in terms of practical, widespread use at the beginning of the screening process? It's certainly what all the guidelines ask for. It has its strengths, it has its challenges. Where do you see all this going, and how do you see it rolling out? Brave one, go first.
Roger, I'm going to say something and then hand it over to Naim and, of course, Ian, who's been doing extensive work in the UK around that and more academically. I have to say I still haven't really received referrals based on FIB4, and it's unfair to demand so because really we don't have an approved treatment. I think that's, for my practice, still a hurdle. Now, that might not be lasting much longer because we're there almost, and we're building activities Naim and Stephen Harrison have been doing to inform colleagues, do general hepatology updates, informing our colleagues to get them ready for drugs for our patients and decide who should be referred. But I would say at this time, we're still preaching, and I haven't seen it in much activity. So there needs more to be done, but we have all the data available, I would say. And this is how I would like to take the first shot at goal for my referring physicians here in my neighborhood.
Okay, Naim, go ahead.
Yeah, I have the same situation like Jörn. I keep telling my colleagues and APPs, advanced practice practitioners, that we have not received one referral for elevated FIB4 from an endocrine office or primary care office. I think we discussed this at a previous episode, Roger. My issue is that, FIB4 is definitely available, it's cheap. I like the pathway. I think it's better than the status quo. The problem is if you go by the 1.3 cut point as the cut point point you're going to use to send patients for FibroScan or order the ELF test. It's a lot of patients, especially if you take patients with type 2 diabetes. Now we're going to ask endocrinologists to send us about 1/3 of their patients to get a FibroScan, which is not widely available. And then when we do the FibroScan, about 70% of these patients will have low liver stiffness. So now we send them back to the endocrinologist. And then we say, do this every 1 to 2 years. And that frequency, to be honest with you, is mind-boggling to me. I don't understand how we came up with this, especially in patients with type 2 diabetes. I mean, with the disease that takes a long time. And, people say, it doesn't cost anything, so do it. But I'm like, no, it does cost a lot of money to the healthcare system between, the referrals and patients, having to pay copays and then us finding time to see them, doing the FibroScan to send them back to endocrinology. So what I would like to see is FIB4 is great. I'm not asking to change the algorithm, but I would like to see democracy when it comes to NITs, where you can actually combine FIB4 with a way to measure liver stiffness. There's so many new developments. Actually, at the Desert Liver Conference, we had 4 companies exhibit their technologies that all of them can give you a CAP score and also liver stiffness. So in addition to FibroScan, we had eScopics with the hepatoscope. We had Mindray. They also have a liver scope. And then we had Velicure from Sonic Insights. And at the end of the day, I would say access to any of these endocrine or primary care office will be the way to go. So you do the FIB4, then you follow with the FibroScan or similar technology, and then you send us patients with liver stiffness more than 8. Then your positive predictive value and the yield of the referral is definitely much, much better than just relying on FIB4. So again, 1.3, great to rule out, but if you're going to send patients based on the 1.3, it's a problem. And the algorithm is based on FibroScan, which is not widely available. And then ELF in the United States, the reimbursement is not good at all. And we're struggling with copays and patients coming back to us, asking us, why do I have to pay this much money for blood tests? No one mentioned this to me. So these are the real issues, real life issues we're dealing with.
So, Ian, let's go across the pond. You're not going to have Resmetirom in a month under any circumstances. But what do you foresee around this whole issue in the moment?
So I think there are a few things. One is that our local commission pathway means that every patient that we see who's got an elevated ALT in the context of metabolic risk factors has a FIB4 and now has a FibroScan. And we don't see them unless their FibroScan is more than 10. And we can debate thresholds and cutoffs and who are the most appropriate patients to see and all the rest of it. But the big issue, as I see it, around the potential availability of Resmetirom is the population. So we've got a model that looks to identify patients who've got significant liver disease, meaning advanced fibrosis or cirrhosis. But if we're going to come and make a treatment decision in a population that's got significant fibrosis or advanced fibrosis but not cirrhosis, then that is an even bigger ask of the non-invasive tests. What we're trying to solve at the moment with the referral pathways is a relatively simple problem, which is to identify only patients above a threshold, whereas when we come to the treatment decision, it's going to be both patients above and below a threshold, and that's going to be really, really tough.
What makes that so hard?
Well, because the cutoffs are not absolute. To identify people who've got significant fibrosis, then be looking at a sort of a positive predictor value that's not 100%. Whereas to exclude cirrhosis, you're also looking at a value that doesn't have 100% negative predictor value. So the range is going to be very narrow between those two values. And so you're going to end up excluding a lot of patients who would be potentially eligible for treatment because the only area of certainty is the very narrow center in the middle between, your sort of early disease cutoff and your cirrhosis cutoff.
So I made the decision not to invite a patient advocate today, but as I listened to Ian's comments, I think back to Jeff McIntyre 2 weeks ago, talking about the definition of the initial NASH drug target population in the U.S. being just a few 100,000 people. I think that was what he said, 200,000 to 300,000. Do I remember that number correctly? Which, Ian, means in a country of our size that we're fundamentally going to take what you just described, shrink it by a factor of 10, and then try to cope with it. And you're not talking about anything quite as tight as that. So what do you foresee would make that better or more manageable or help us do a better job of identifying a non-cirrhotic need to treat population, if that's going to be the target for Resmetirom, for example?
Well, that's a nearly impossible question with the tools that we have because they're good, but they're not perfect. So we either need a sort of shift in the way that we think, so away from tied to fibrosis stage and towards prognosis, or we need better tests and or better availability of better tests. The sort of logical conclusion of that means that you'd need MR elastography for everybody, but that's not a tractable solution population in a high prevalence disease. So there are trade-offs on all sides of that.
Let me take a pragmatic shot at this, Ian, and I think Naim has a comment on that too. If we see a patient with fatty liver disease and he has ALT, double upper limit of normal, and he has a FibroScan that's abnormal, I'm just going to treat him and see what happens, because if I have a drug that's fairly safe, that's the good point. The question then comes in, what does the label say and what does the payer say? In the European system, it will be treatment according to label, and the payer will have to cope with that. And I think in the US, and Naim, you're in a better position to say that than I am, the payers could actually come up with extra rules and regulations on who you have to select for treatment.
To follow up on what you're saying, Ian, regarding, ruling out cirrhosis, I'm just curious, what cut point would you use to rule out cirrhosis? With liver stiffness, with the KPA, and then maybe with ELF and FIB4? Because the ASLD in their guidance document published a table actually would rule in and rule out cut points for cirrhosis, and the rule out cut points are ridiculously low that you will be excluding all the patients that will benefit from Resmetirom. So I would love to hear your thoughts, and what cut points would you use?
Well, I think this is exactly the problem, is that we haven't defined those cut points, because the way that we've thought has been about identification of significant disease. I don't know that anybody's using tests like that. And that's why those thresholds are very low, because if you don't want to miss cirrhosis, then you have to have a liver stiffness value of less than 8 or 9 or maybe 10. There's only grey.
Yeah, I think this is the point I was trying to make. If you guys look at the guidance document to rule out cirrhosis, they have liver stiffness listed less than 8. Well, okay, that's like if you want to be 100%, but then, actually Resmetirom in my mind is going to be indicated for patients with liver stiffness of at least 8 and higher. Of course, if your liver stiffness is 20 or 18 but low platelet count, you can diagnose cirrhosis that way. But this is very important that we cannot just say, use the guidance document to rule out cirrhosis, because it's going to create major issues. I think, Roger, during the Desert Liver Conference, we had several cases how we're going to use Resmetirom. And as Jörn mentioned, if you have someone with liver stiffness of 11.5 kPa and the ALT is at 60-70, and you do imaging, the liver surface is smooth, there's no splenomegaly, the platelet count is very good, the FIB4 is low, I have no problem starting a patient like that on Resmetirom. In my mind, this is a patient with F3 fibrosis. Of course, with FibroScan, you can never be very confident about one specific fibrosis stage, but this is someone at least with significant fibrosis. I think we have a lot of safety data in patients with early cirrhosis that Resmetirom is safe, and I think this is the patient population I want to treat aggressively. We cannot be paralyzed by nuances and studies that evaluated every single test in multiple populations, and you have to keep in mind your positive predictive value and negative predictive value are affected by the population you study and the prevalence of the disease state you're trying to identify. So I think there is a practical way. I think we have hundreds of patients in our own practice that are ready to be on Resmetirom. I think the estimates are around 6-7 million people with F2 fibrosis and MASH in the United States, but I agree that the majority of them are not in the care of a specialist who's going to get them started on Resmetirom. And that goes back to the first point that you brought up, which is really, what pathway we're going to use. And is it really going to change after the medicine is approved? Can we fight that lack of aggressiveness in identifying disease stage by primary care doctors and endocrinologists if we have treatment? And I think the answer will be yes, once we start showing them examples of patients that are seen by them that will benefit from Resmetirom, that if they didn't do a FIB4 or FibroScan would have been easily missed.
So first of all, audience, if you're wondering why Ian didn't respond to that, he's fallen off the call for the moment. He'll be back, I'm sure. Jörn, go ahead.
Those are the points Naim was raising. I've been thinking to myself, again, not having access to the drug for a little bit of time, I'll learn from what Naim and colleagues are going to be doing in the US. I think the other thing is patients are going to be asking us about the drug. They're going to be asking, well, why don't I get the drug? And how can you relate on that NIT, knowing all its flaws, to not give me that drug or recommend it? So I think we want to be cost effective and treat the right people. There's going to be a lot of patients asking for that drug, and based on what am I going to rule them out? So this is the other challenge, right?
Just to add to this, I think this will be one of the questions for today is, what else can we do besides FibroScan, ALT? We talked about MR elastography. ELF is focused on liver fibrosis, but to diagnose at-risk MASH, the patient population for Resmetirom, we recently started doing a test called OWL liver, which is based on this MASLD score. This is based on metabolomics and the identification of specific lipid species that can predict at-risk MASH. And I find it easy to order, and we've done it in 100 patients. I'm waiting to analyze the data, so I hope I can share with you guys at a following episode. We've also done something called liver fast, which is different than the FAST score. This is a blood test that's similar to FibroTest or FibroSure, but they use AI to improve the algorithm, and it has several biomarkers for fibrosis, and it gives you disease activity, disease steatosis grade, and fibrosis stage. So this is another thing. I think, Roger, we talk a lot about NITs to monitor response to treatment, and we have all these sophisticated things that we talk about in academia. But during the Desert Liver Conference, we realized that we're going to use your ALT, AST, and liver stiffness on FibroScan, maybe the CAP score, and follow. But the key is it's going to be multiple assessments. It's not going to be just 2 time points like what we do in the clinical trials with the biopsy. And the trend is going to be more important than just a 2 time point assessment and reassessment.
That's so important. I think it comes down to, it's almost like an area under the curve. How is it changing? Where did they start? You're not going to use the one where they come in with pneumonia and are on antibiotics, and you're not going to consider that for the treatment indication. There's so many aspects influencing ALT, of course, but really, if you have longitudinal repeated assessment of that test, you get a sense of the baseline level, you get a sense of changes and fluctuations in patients, and then you can use it to make recommendations on therapy. I agree. It's the simple things, the simple tests done right that could be used in clinical practice more easily. Everything else is not going to be available at the scale we need access to.
No, and I think just commenting on a couple of things that have been raised. Liver units have ALT and AST. Primary care, a lot, and Michael Patel said this in Canada, they don't have access to it. So I think there are multiple questions to ask. We need to put our healthcare structures in place so these calculations are calculated like HbA1c, like all of these things. They're calculated when somebody does a test as routine to flag it up to primary care in any country. We probably need to standardize a lot of diagnosed early non-invasive tests and biomarkers. And that's a difficulty we have in the UK. The majority of areas still do not have AST access. To add that on can be in the region of £69, which makes it more costly than some of the FibroScans themselves. So there's various problems. When we look at who to treat, we've got a very good example in the UK. When we did the hepatitis C rollout, it was controlled from a governmental or NHS England level, whereby we ruled in people with lower disease cut thresholds, 10.5 kilopascals, to ensure that we treated not only the patients with cirrhosis, but the patients with developing disease to try and slow down that progress. And what we saw was a big reduction in liver transplant needs, patients not being as anxious. And I know that Tony Velotti and other patients on the podcast have said, what happens to me? And I think, Jörn, you raised that question. I'm in that no man's land group. I want to stop the progression of the disease. So I think it depends what question we're asking and answering. Are we trying to avoid liver transplantation, reduce cancer thresholds in these populations that are at higher risk? And we can therefore be a little bit more lenient on the cut thresholds. But whether or not we use FibroScan, whether or not we use other non-invasives, I think the school's out. But we've just got to get that first one. FIB4 is not perfect, but it's better than what we had before, which was nothing in all reality.
So, question about that. And this goes back, I think, to what Naim was saying. If FIB4 is only going to miss in one direction, then that's easier to make up for, right? But we've seen a couple of papers published recently that suggest that we're missing in both directions by big numbers, which adds to Naim, in the States today, where people don't tend to have primary care and endo certainly don't have much access to scanning of any kind. If we're going to miss on both ends, then what do we do about that this week or this month, or really more to the point, this 6 months?
Well, that's a difficult question, but we are better now than we were a couple of years ago. We need to progress, and we are progressing. And I don't think we can have a perfect early assessment yet. We just can't even get FIB4 in most places. But we're certainly better. We're moving in the right direction, because before FIB4 was in the algorithm, it was just left to personal choice as to whether you referred and you responded to an abnormal liver function test. And I think John Dillon and the team were suggesting that only 5% of those patients with abnormal liver function tests were actually acted upon. So that's what we're left with.
That's a good example too, Louise, because John Dillon's group has championed the automation of lab detection. And I think it's going to come down to repeated testing using an algorithm or some software that's running in the back end of the EHR to flag patients. So we'll do retesting, okay? I think Ian made the comment earlier about the 2 or 3 years intervals, which is probably not right for everybody. It's too strict or not strict enough. And you probably need a more individualized approach. And we can use technology and EHR data that's repeatedly assessed to inform us on that. And we'll miss patients to the upper and the lower end, but by retesting, we'll hopefully narrow that window a little bit and at least pick up the ones that are rapidly progressing and identify the right ones to be treated or retested.
So somebody want to give Ian a 30-second summary of everything he missed in the last 10 minutes so that he can rejoin?
Ian, I basically raised the issue that with NHS England, the hepatitis C rollout programme, we used lower cut-offs to include patients with advancing disease. And that programme worked very, very well, so that we were able to identify more patients and treat more, and therefore bring down this transplantation need, the HCC, all of the issues that we saw, so that there could be this use of more lenient thresholds to increase the population at risk to reduce the outcome in the end. And that most places do not have access to AST in this country, and therefore even getting FIB4 routinely in the UK is a real problem. So we might need to solve that problem first.
Yeah. So I heard a bit of what Naim was saying about FibroScan of 11.5 and platelet count of 180, being confident that the patient had F3. And this all plays into the same issue about how confident we can be about stage of liver disease. And I don't want to draw any of the investigators' attention to how good they were at identifying disease that met the inclusion criteria for the trials, because the screen failure rates were really quite high, suggesting that maybe we aren't that good at identifying those patients. And I think the real UK issue is around cost and cost effectiveness, and there's going to be considerable uncertainty around that when it comes to the payer decision. Should Madrigal pursue licensing in the UK, which as yet we've not seen any evidence of. So there's quite a lot of water to go under that bridge, and I think the big difference with hepatitis C medicines was that was initially for patients who had cirrhosis, and you're right, the FibroScan liver stiffness threshold was set quite low, and that was because we understood that those patients were urgent need of treatment, and that treatment really was of benefit because the surrogate was established. In this context, I expect, unfortunately, we're going to see tighter restrictions rather than looser restrictions, and I have a significant fear that because of the way that the trials have been done and the payers' averseness to paying for drugs where there's considerable uncertainty, that this whole conversation about using non-invasive tests to select patients for treatments in the UK is likely to be moot, and that we will be stuck with liver biopsy in the beginning. I mean, I hope that won't be the case, but it's what they do for cancer drugs, and I think that it's foreseeable that in trials that select using liver biopsy, that's what we'll see, particularly where the condition that's being treated is MASH, and we honestly don't have a good biomarker for that. We have, reasonable biomarkers for fibrosis, but not for the MASH. So I think it's a sort of long and perhaps slightly depressing outlook for what I think we're likely to see in the UK, and I suspect that might be seen in other more cost-constrained settings too.
Interesting. Jörn, what are you likely to see in Germany, do you think?
The situation in Germany is a little different. If we get EMA approval, this will be carried over into the German system, in my understanding, and then there is an assessment of the drug over the standard of care as a comparator in the first year. And that first year, the full price is going to be negotiated. It might be that they said, well, the comparator is bariatric surgery or physical exercise or some other drug that is in a comparable situation. That's the big question. And that then leads in the end to the pricing.
based on the data they have submitted to that cost effectiveness analysis. It's a little bit more of a political and regulatory process here, but if it's an approved drug in the EU, there will be very little arguments for the company to not have it launched in Germany.
So as I'm listening to this conversation, one of the things I'm thinking about is that we read about technologies emerging. There were papers last year about NIS2. There's been some stuff about MASLD recently. As Naim pointed out, 4 different people were showing scans, candidly, with different price points and different economics around them at the Desert Liver Conference last weekend. And I think the people who are looking to compete with EchoSens are looking at the financial models they use to do that and what they need to do to make it more attractive in primary care and endocrinology. So I expect we'll see that will be a place where people will push to go to endocrinology, at least in the States. Louise, you're better positioned, I think, than any of us to talk about what's happening with scanning in the UK. But I guess my question is, A, is NIS2 a better enough test to matter? Is MASLD a better enough test to matter? Do we see other things that are being reasonably well researched that we're confident will be better enough than what we have right now to matter? And then B, when you get outside the States, where I think eventually somebody will figure out how to make the economics of scanning work in primary care, possibly EchoSens, possibly somebody else. What happens when you leave the U.S., where government controls the purchase of that kind of stuff a lot more regularly, a lot more assiduously? Start on question 1. Are the tests coming that are good enough or better enough?
There are clearly tests that outperform, right? Fit for standard ALTs. However, they are not available at a large enough scale, I would say, at this time to be used in clinical practice. And then the important thing is typically testing is not reimbursed. And the question is, who pays for the testing? Is this the patient? Is this the company that provides the drug? That can't be, and that's in the European system. But I'll hand it over to my colleagues.
Naim, I don't know if you heard, but the question basically was, you look at NIS2, you look at MASLD, you look at some of the other things that are studied. Are there, given the limitations that we've got right now, are there going to be blood-based tests coming? Or, in fact, will the new scanning devices you were talking about from last weekend coming in a way that will make this a lot easier to get done more efficiently or more cost effectively and with better results? Can you envision that on the horizon right now? And if so, what do you think it looks like?
Yeah, definitely. With NIS4, the plan is to move forward with the NIS2 Plus, which has, similar accuracy. My understanding is it's not going to be available anytime soon. So we're talking about maybe in a couple of years from now. I might be wrong. I'm not speaking on behalf of LabCorp or anyone, but it's not commercially available. But I can envision a scenario where you do the fiber scan and let's say liver stiffness is 8.59. You're not too sure. You do a blood test like MASLD or, our liver, and then you get at-risk MASH. And you can argue that this patient has at-risk MASH. We have, one imaging test, one blood test showing us the same thing, and you get them started on treatment. I think the biggest missing piece for these blood tests is the longitudinal follow-up and how they change in response to treatment. That data is being generated, but, I cannot rely on them to say I'm going to select patients for treatment and then use the same test to assess response to treatment. So as I mentioned earlier, the response to treatment is going to be that trend in ALT, AST, and liver stiffness. And this is what we do for other liver diseases. So, with PBC, we use alkaline phosphatase bilirubin and liver stiffness. For autoimmune hepatitis, we use ALT, AST, and liver stiffness. So this is how we do it in hepatology for the most part. And in challenging cases, we do more advanced testing.
The big issue around this is we need Quentin there now to talk to you about pretest probability and the amount that's changed by each of these tests. Because a single test alone is not going to take you from what is always going to be a low pretest probability in patients who've got metabolic risk factors and a modestly elevated ALT. So it's going to have to be a series of tests, and whether and that's likely to be a blood-based test and an imaging test of some sort, and whether that is FIB4 plus FibroScan, whether it's NIS2 plus FibroScan or plus something different. You're going to need at least 2 biomarkers, I think, to have reasonable confidence that you have got a patient who's at risk who is going to benefit from treatment. Exactly how that is done is probably going to be different to the algorithms that we're currently using to just look for the presence of sufficient fibrosis for patients to enter hepatology services in the UK, where the thresholds would be different for patients in the US and possibly different for patients in Germany. So and I don't think we know what the optimal combination of tests is. And maybe the NAIL and NIT screening programs will give us some of that information, but it won't give us all of it, I don't think. And one of the big things that is, I hope, going to result from a licensed therapy is some large-scale investigator-initiated programs to try and answer some of these questions about who the treatment population really is, what the effect of drug is in practice, and what the beneficial effects of treatment are.
I was just going to pick up on the point of the different opportunities and the options that we have in scanning. And I think they will develop out. I don't think there's any doubt of that. One of the problems we've had in the past is shear wave figures most people don't understand. If you speak to most physicians, they understand kilopascals by FibroScan, escopics, or hepatoscope, and escopics is a surrogate of FibroScan and use the same levels. So I think we can say that that's an interchangeable level of stiffness. Most of the machines that I managed to catch sight of at the conference were still quite large machines. They're not point of care. Going out to primary care, I am more than happy to discuss models with people about how to make this highly cost effective, but it's unlikely to be the producers of the devices that do that. And I think we sit in the luxury field of all coming from a hepatology background where we have highly skilled practitioners who can operate these devices. If you look at the evidence coming out of the Locate NAFLD study in Australia, physicians got 66% of those patients, nurses got 99%. The more we increase the ability to scan, the more likely we are to weaken the skill set of the people scanning. And remember, when I scan, I don't just scan MASH and MASLD. I scan autoimmune, which has a totally different level of cutoff. I'm scanning different patients with different diseases for different reasons, not just lifestyle and early detection. So I think you do need a level of knowledge behind. And what we don't want to do is make these tests not worth the levels, or people lack trust as we have lots of devices. So I think we need to have safety for patients and quality. And I think FibroScan is regulated in the UK. It's a diagnostic ultrasound, and therefore it comes with certain levels of safety for that. So I think I'm all for welcoming in everything that gets out to a patient. We just need to be careful how that's done by any of the devices. But I like what I've seen, and I've just got my hands on the brand new technology from EchoSense today, and it's the only one in the UK. So it's very exciting, the guided VCTE.
So Louise, I've told people forever you're a one-off. There you go. Naim, go ahead.
One of the biggest factors would be pricing, right? And, how much Resmetirom would be priced at on a yearly basis. And, there's that ISA report that said it's cost effective between 39, if I remember correctly, to like 52,000, which in my mind was very high. And there was a recent paper that looked at cost effectiveness, and based on their modeling, they said around 19,000 would be cost effective. So big gap here, but that's going to be really an important deciding factor for us and for payers. The way we're thinking about Resmetirom, it's a liver-directed therapy with at least proven anti-fibrotic effects in the phase 3, whereas medications like semaglutide, we did not see that efficacy on fibrosis in the phase 2b. One of the biggest questions already is, how are you going to decide between semaglutide and Resmetirom? Although semaglutide does not have the MASH indication, the majority of patients with MASH have an indication for semaglutide. And, we shared a few cases at the meeting also. So if you have someone with F3, heading toward F4, they've been on another GLP-1, let's say they've been on Trulicity, and yet they're, progressing in fibrosis stages, probably it's an easy pick to go with Resmetirom. But if I have someone that looks like early stage 2 with high BMI, 45, uncontrolled diabetes, and their liver stiffness, let's say, is 8.5 kilopascals, do I envision a scenario where I start semaglutide for the obesity or diabetes indication and then repeat my NITs in 6 months and see what happens, and then I can start Resmetirom? The hope was that Resmetirom would be priced cheaper than semaglutide and tirzepatide, but we'll see what happens. And if it's priced highly, then we're going to be also more selective in the patients that we get started. Obviously, it's not like we have an easy time getting semaglutide and tirzepatide, and unfortunately, sometimes insurance will deny them completely. Like I can tell you in my experience, Medicaid patients in Arizona have no access to weight loss medications, and many commercial insurance also, they will say this is not our preferred drug, so you have to try Trulicity first, or even some older versions of GLP-1s, and it's really not fair because we know the data, we know the difference in weight loss. So I think these are all scenarios that we're thinking about. I think my colleagues in Europe, you guys have it easy because we have to do the hard work and then share the experience, and then you pick and choose what you want to implement. And we understand our structure is very different, and our patients, sometimes it's not the same. It's not, a government structure deciding who gets to be treated. We don't have the same leverage negotiating with pharma companies, and I hope things will change for us, but we will start prescribing. I mean, our team is getting ready. The night we get Resmetirom approved, I'm going to create an SOP for the team, how we're going to use it, monitor who are the appropriate patients, and how often we need to do labs, when do they need to come back to clinic. So we have a large database, and I think many of our patients will qualify from day one.
So Naim, a thought and a question. Here's the thought. My friends in Europe, my health economist friends in Europe taught me a long time ago that once you leave the U.S., there is a clear direct relationship between the price of the drug and the size of the patient population that's targeted. Mm-hmm. So there is a population for which 39 to 52 will be cost effective. There is a population at which 19 will be cost effective. Just a wild guess, but the 19 population is going to be a lot larger. And so 39, if they go in the 39 to 52 range, they're immediately shooting at a smaller target population, which is why my ears perked up a couple of weeks ago when Jeff McIntyre said we may only be talking about 300,000-400,000 patients here, because that would line up with that kind of ICER pricing.
No, I mean, I totally agree. At the end of the day, as a doctor, as a healthcare provider, I would love to see the price go down, because whether there is, insurance coverage, that's good or not, someone is paying that price. Unfortunately, he know more than I do, but we have a crazy system here, and we have all these PBMs that actually they like the drug to be priced higher, and then they like to get the largest rebate because this is how they make more money. And this has been a big issue for us. So it's not only the pharma companies. Actually, sometimes pharma companies want to price the drug lower, but they are pushed by the PBMs to price it higher and then give them higher rebates. And I don't want to get into an area where I'm not an expert, but I would love to hear your thoughts, Roger, on this.
First of all, yes. Okay, my thoughts are really simple. You're right. Okay, you're right. Everything you just said is correct. Okay, the pressure to push prices higher does come from PBMs. And the only issue in which I might not disagree with you, but might have questions, is if you take the $19,000 price, I don't know exactly how many patients we're talking about. But it's not clear right now that this system is capable of handling that many patients. Even at the community hepatologist level, do we have enough community hepatologists to handle the inflow at a $19,000 price? I don't know. I'm assuming that work was done, that Madrigal has access to it, and that where they wind up will depend in part on the answer to that question. Number one. Here's my number two. You made a really interesting observation about GLP-1s, which I think is accurate. If you're on Medicaid or if you don't have the money, getting a hold of a GLP-1 right now is challenging. If you have the money, you can pick up the phone, you can call any one of these teledoc services, and they'll prescribe and you can pay. And that could be for somebody trying to lose 15 pounds to fit into a bikini, or it could be somebody who really needs to make a lifestyle change. I'm wondering how the advent of teledoc GLP-1s completely outside of the electronic medical record system is going to affect anything that you do in terms of your diagnostics, your treatment, anything. And that really is a U.S.-centric question right now, although I'll turn it back to our ex-U.S. colleagues after you answer.
I mean, I can tell you it's affecting us in the clinical trial world already, because many of these trials exclude anyone on a GLP-1. The ones that allow the patients to be on a GLP-1, they want them to be stable for 90 days on the same dose. And sometimes we find a good candidate, we tell them about the trials, they're like, oh, I just started semaglutide 2 weeks ago. And that means they're on the lowest dose, and now they're going to up-titrate every 4 weeks. And then we bring them back after, let's say, 6 months. We think they're going to be stable, but then they tell you, oh, they stopped paying for my semaglutide 2 months ago, and then I just resumed the dose last week. And so it's creating these issues. The other thing is, in the context of treating MASH, I mean, a good percentage of patients will respond to semaglutide alone, especially the early F2s. Sometimes we go by liver stiffness as an indicator of presence of significant disease, but the confidence level is not very high. And as they lose weight, that KPA number can drop very quickly to a threshold that looks more like, no significant fibrosis whatsoever. So I think it's going to affect Resmetirom, no doubt. And then in 2025, we may get the indication for MASH. Latest should be 2026. So that's going to be direct competition then. And I'm not discounting, the possibility that in a large phase 3, semaglutide may have a positive impact on fibrosis regression. Because if you look at the placebo response rate in the phase 2b was too high compared to what we got with other programs. So there's still that chance, although we know they don't have any direct effects on the liver, it's mediated by weight loss. We know from lifestyle intervention trials that looked at weight loss that if you lose 10% or more of your total body weight, in one study at least, there's fibrosis regression in 45%. And we know that in the semaglutide trials, about 75% of patients lose 10% or more. So I would suspect that, there's a chance at least that fibrosis may regress in the phase 3.
Thoughts for Europe in all this?
Yeah, I've got a few few thoughts about it. I mean, the co-prescription or use of semaglutide in this patient population is to be expected. It's a drug that is associated with quality of life and actual benefits. Reduction in cardiovascular outcomes, recently published. These are medications that we know do good. And for the patient with multimorbidity that includes obesity and or diabetes, then a lot of the patients, as you say, Naim, have got existing indications for those. And it's reasonable that those are used first in priority against drugs where there's an idea that there might be benefit, but it's not yet proven. So that, I think, is an important observation, and it's real world. And once Novo Nordisk have sorted out their supply problems and have completely taken over the whole of the GDP of Denmark, then it would be less of an issue. The other thing that I would point out in the cost effectiveness debate is that the price that's being paid for the high-dose semaglutide, the Ozempic in the UK, is commercially sensitive, so it's not disclosed because they've had to provide it at a discount compared to what they wanted to provide it at so that it would come in as cost-effective in the UK, right? And that's a drug that has clear and established benefits. So I think it'd be interesting to see when Resmetirom comes to pricing in the UK where it's pitched, but I think that some of the high prices that are being talked about are quite optimistic.
Roger, just to add to the GLP-1 debate, I guess, I have no doubt that Resmetirom will have a large patient population. Just a few scenarios where I think Resmetirom will be used first is anyone with lean MASH. Obviously, if your BMI is 22, 23, but you have, dyslipidemia, other risk factors, we think you have lean MASH. Probably we're not going to go with the GLP-1. I think the second patient category is anyone who cannot get it because of insurance issues. And then third is patients that have been on a different GLP-1 or maybe even semaglutide. Not everyone is going to respond. Some people don't lose weight. There's that 5-10% that don't lose much weight. They lose 5-6 pounds and that's it. Some people lost weight, but they plateaued after, they lose the first 30-35 pounds, but they still have F3 fibrosis. And then tolerability is an issue. And I see also scenarios where we use combination. Again, if, you have a very high BMI, uncontrolled diabetes, and stage 3 fibrosis, I really see no reason why I cannot prescribe semaglutide as a hepatologist to treat the obesity, which I do routinely, and also add Resmetirom for the F3 fibrosis, because until I have convincing evidence that semaglutide is going to do the trick, I don't want to wait on someone and let them progress to cirrhosis, at least in the context of clinical trials. And I know this is very debatable, but in the context of clinical trials, about 20% of patients with F3 will progress to cirrhosis within 2.5 years. Again, this is probably not your typical general population, F3, but still, that's terrifying, right? That you don't have, 10 years to act on this.
Okay, I have one more question and about the drugs, and then I want to go back to devices to wrap up. Tell me about tirzepatide. How does an agent that's maybe more effective and has direct liver effects change anybody's calculus or thinking about any of this stuff?
I'll tell you quickly, I do have to drop off, but tirzepatide, we don't think it has major, liver-directed effects. I think, the glucagon drugs like pemvidutide, survodutide, they have more direct liver effects, but tirzepatide is more potent in terms of the weight loss. I think we've had two major developments last couple of weeks with really amazing results with survodutide, which is from Boehringer Ingelheim dual agonist, more potent on the GLP-1, my understanding, than the glucagon. So that's why it still has a good effect on A1C. And then just today, there was a press release with Akero also, the 96-week biopsy data from the Harmony trial. And if you look at the primary analysis and, take it with a grain of salt, not the intent to treat analysis, but still 75% with the high dose had fibrosis regression by one stage after 96 weeks. That's amazing, with obviously significant delta from placebo. And on top of that, about 1/3 of patients had 2 fibrosis stage regression. So I'm very encouraged by this, and I think it speaks to liver-directed effects. Going back to survodutide, from the press release, it seems like it had statistically significant effect on fibrosis, which is different than semaglutide.
Okay, so Naim, first of all, I was listening to that, not seeing it. I heard that 2-level drop number, and that was totally ear-popping. It was almost like the plane dropping 20,000 feet at once, or 6,000 meters for the rest of you. Final question, Naim, I'm going to ask you this first because you got to jump, and then we'll go in the order for us to go. Here's what we kind of said today, right? NITs, messy landscape, even in terms of how to diagnose initially, we're probably going to wind up for a while on tried and true AST, ALT, GGT, maybe some kind of measure of stiffness is going to be what we're going to be doing to track disease. That's not likely to change anytime in the future, in the immediate future.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think maybe doing a baseline test like our liver or maybe NIS2 plus to increase the positive predictive value to select the right patients. We may see more of this happening in the next year or two. And maybe if we are lucky to increase access to MR technology, at least in specialty clinics, we may do more like MRE and MASLD score, MEFib, potentially corrected T1 if we have better commercial access. But yeah, I agree. For the at least disease monitoring, I think it's going to rely on simple things that we can do every visit, like ALT and liver stiffness, and maybe utilizing some of the new liver stiffness devices.
And then the other thing I think I heard along with that, just confirm real quickly, is that the blood-based biopsies that are coming aren't going to have an impact very quickly because they're not going to get here that quickly. That if anything's likely to happen quickly, it's going to revolve around the competition and increased use of VCT and other scanning devices.
Yes, I agree. And, we're working on a couple of projects to actually implement these devices at the primary care and endocrine offices, and hoping that we get support from pharma companies like Madrigal and Novo Nordisk, so we can start upstream. And then as specialists, we are seeing patients that are more likely to need actually pharmacologic treatment.
Okay. Thank you, my friend. If you got to jump. Everybody else, same question. What changes in the next year or two over what you're doing now, both in terms of initial diagnosis and tracking patients, if anything? And Ian, I know you've done a lot of work on different interesting composite strategies. And if you want to mention that for a minute, now would be a good time to do that.
So I think the reality for us is that our pathway is so well established and does what we want it to do at the moment, which is to identify those with significant disease. That this, particularly where we're not likely to have a drug to use in the clinic for at least 18 months and probably, I think, significantly longer than that. We are where we are, and we've got the tools that we need.
And in the absence of a drug, with the tools that you need today, nothing's going to change. It's going to kind of sit.
Yeah, that's exactly where we are.
Jörn, what do you see where you live and in other countries that you talk to? Because I know you talk to people all over the world.
More righteous use of LFTs and more awareness of elevated liver function tests in patients with a disease that's then druggable. I think there will be an uptake that takes time, but we'll be seeing a movement that actually moves liver out of the, there's nothing you can do about it. Shrug your shoulders, move on, have less alcohol momentum. I think we'll see more monitoring of ALFTs. We'll see more referrals from physicians. We'll see more patients inquiring about drugs, and we'll learn about the changes of the tests we have available today to be used and guide us on, how long to use the drug. Of course, the question is on whom to start the drug. Anyways, I think this is a little easier than how long to use it these days. And we might even go back to doing liver biopsies in some patients where we think this is debatable, this is borderline, or this is needed to influence a treatment decision. So it might be a little bit more of that because there's just more patients showing up. I think there's a clear momentum for the approval of drug in this indication.
Okay, and then Louise, last and certainly not least, what do you see on the ground in both the places where you're seeing the ground right now? And this week in England, last month Australia, where do you see all that going?
Well, I think Australia, I'll start there, is interesting because we're still pending the formal announcement of the new NAFL guidelines, which in September muted that they were going to still lead with ultrasound because FibroScan or any of the stiffness diagnostics aren't currently on Medicare. So therefore patients have to pay for them themselves, which in the setting of Resmetirom coming out would put them well behind the rest of the areas being able to locate and direct patients into care. And I think there's a genuine lack of knowledge in primary care. From the UK's perspective, I think we have an opportunity here to see how this could roll out. We are making potentially FibroScan more available to primary care, and therefore the potential to locate and educate primary care, not only physicians, but nurses, staff and patients about liver health and liver risks, means that we have an opportunity to take people off the timeline because of that better education and awareness, and to be able to detect earlier by better engagement. Now, that's a massive task. And is the system set? Yes, we have a guidance, but we don't have a procurement system that's set to be able to deliver that. And therefore, it's going to fall on liver units to develop those outpatient strategies, if you can. So I think it's an interesting area that we're entering in the UK because we have encouraged primary care to get more access to this test to add on. So Ian's obviously done a lot of work in that. We're now going to see whether or not other areas can fit and increase those thresholds. So yeah, it's an exciting area, and it's nice to be part of it and potentially push that needle. But we're a long way off getting medication, as Ian states. And I have a feeling if we go through the NICE route, which we have to, that we don't have enough UK-centric data to be able to do that yet. I suppose Ian's the expert for here on that, not me. I'm just excited to get new toys to play with and to engage with patients. And the MASLD one with the new toys that we could really take off in primary care, because that's where the majority sits. And I'm seeing.
So, Ian, you'll have to come back and talk about all that, because I'm going to invite you back for the episode after the PDUFA date about how's the rest of the world affected by the U.S. launch of Resmetirom, and that'll be a focus topic that can get to some of these other issues. For now, I'm going to jump. I want to thank all of you for joining us. I'll be back in a moment with Question of the Week and then the business report. Naim in absentia, thank you. Ian, Louise, Jörn in present, thank you.
Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
And now, here's Roger with this week's Question of the Week.
This is our Question of the Week. Today's episode, we talked a lot about NITs, and while a little bit was about new technology, a lot was about the practical issues of how to use the NITs that we have in practice today. Our question for you, if you are a physician, how do you anticipate your use of NITs changing after you've got drugs available in the market? For industry people, what do you believe will be the most important success factor for NIT adoption? Better product, better education, better training? And in both cases, why do you say that? Get us your answers quickly, and you might be part of our podcast next week. Thanks.
And now for the Season 5, Episode 5 Business Report.
Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine, and also Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live. Not a lot's new, and I don't have a lot to report, except that I continue to admire tremendously the heroism of people who have so much to lose and yet work to surge forward every day. The Russians who shouted praise of Navalny or left flowers by his grave. The Ukrainian soldier at the front, exhausted, short of shells and missiles, yet fighting on because what they are fighting for matters so much to them and to the entire West.
Let's talk about reviews.
With increasing fervor for Bibi to go, and people throughout the West who appreciate what happened in Israel on October 7th, pushing to remember that Gazans are people and that most of the Palestinians there are innocent pawns of Hamas. Let's remember the pain and deprivation that lies behind all this courage. Here in the States today, we have the opportunity never to need to be that courageous, but we must be vigilant and active in defense of our democracy now. Charoyim Slava, glory to heroes, and also Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live.
Thanks for the strong start to listener numbers.
This week, we hit the top 250 health and wellness list, far tougher slog than the top 250 medical list, for the first time since we've been back, this time in Romania. I don't entirely get why so many of our breakthroughs, both when we were breaking through 2 years ago and then again now, have come in Eastern Europe, but I love it. To any of our European Liver Association friends and colleagues who advocated for their Romanian colleagues to listen, I'm even more deeply in your gratitude than I was before. And you know what I mean.
Our Question of the Week continues into its second week.
Last week was our first question of the week. Question worked fine, but the email address crashed. This week, it might be simpler just to try to send questions to questions@surfingmash.com. I expect we'll include a conversation on your answers in next week's edition, either with people who wrote back or perhaps some guest of the podcast.
In programming, we're working on 2 novel concepts. Well, novel at least for us.
As I mentioned last week, we're looking for a podcast next week that focuses on payer issues. Not entirely sure we're going to get it done, but I believe we will. You know, we've never done a payer issue before in all the 240-something issues we've done. Also, I'm starting to work on the post-Resmetirom PDUFA episodes. If there's an individual or a group you would like to make sure to hear from post-PDUFA, write back to questions@surfingmash. Tell me what you're looking for, and I'll see what I can do to help.
This week's vault comes from last week's massive episode.
Maz and Noordine joined us last summer right after the first major MASLD article was published. Like every episode with Maz, this combines levity and deep thinking. You'll hear links to many of the topics we've been discussing in the episodes this past month. Enjoy. That's it for this week. I want to thank our team, Jörn, Louise, Steve, Mike, Eric, as we march ahead, and the people of Romania for considering MASH, as we do, to be a must-listen in health and fitness. Enjoy our conversation Saturday and Sunday. Please take a listen to our question of the week, and of course, please reply. We'll be back next week, talk about payers. Until then, stay safe, surf on. Bye-bye now.
Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to questions@surfingmash.com and we will answer on the podcast or website. Your question might even wind up being the question of the week.